Hello, it's Jared from Yellowwood Guiding, and in this video we're going to talk about macro composition. Composition is probably the most important element of photography. Once you get the settings, the composition really makes or breaks the image. I have lots of people that show up and have great gear, but their compositions are really not great. So working on composition can really improve your image, and that's what we want to look at here. We're going to look at macro photography. So here's a perfect example of a really okay composition, but it's not great. This is a shot that I'm looking for a field guide, and I really didn't care how artistically it looked because I was going to crop it. But if I wanted to really make this image interesting, I would have put the flower over more towards the rule of thirds aspect. So let's take a look at that. With macro photography, generally you're up close. You're generally blurring backgrounds, getting the element in focus. Putting things in the middle is not always bad. If plants grow straight, you should probably give them a straight aspect unless you want to be artistic. So here with the paintbrush, got the flower coming up. It is roughly 1/3 of the way up. So we come over here and go to the crop tool here, where the flower is about 1/3 of the way into the image. So here, I talked about in the rule of thirds video, generally don't want to put anything in the middle, but in square crops, you can put things in the middle because we're actually out on the edges. We put up a rule of thirds, and there's a lot of interesting things going on out here. And actually, if you remember the rule of sixths, lots of interesting things out there. So that's what we want to look at when we're composing on macro shots. This is what I call a macro scape. We're not super close. We've got a background, but by blurring this, we've got a lot of detail. It's not a great image, but sometimes you want to back away from your subject to get a better image. You take a look at this shot, we're kind of really close, and it loses some of its intimacy. Here we've got some more detail back there just to add it. I don't know why, personally, I feel that image isn't as strong as this one, but that's one thing to look at. Sometimes back away, sometimes get closer. Take a look here. What really makes this Columbine shot work is the fact that the background is blurred. It's 1/3 of the way up. We've got blurry backgrounds, but notice I didn't cut off any of these parts. There's no parts cut off that are interesting, just the stems. That's okay to cut off, but I also want to have a blurry background with a low f-stop so that I get just the petals. But make sure your f-stop's deep enough, this is f9, to get all the parts of the flower that you want in focus in focus. Taking a look here, getting really down close to this little tiny flower up on the alpine tundra, I wanted to get this aspect, but if you look, rule of thirds comes into play. We've got that. The flowers down here about rule of sixths, and what makes this image work is the background's just a little bit blurred, but I had to get a deep depth of field to get tip to tip. That makes this whole little scene kind of interesting. We got a flower and other flowers looking up to it. Coming over here, well, here's where things start to get interesting. Starting to get dealing with insects in macro is really important. But one thing to look at, if you've got things coming out of your corners, it's generally not very interesting. If they're, they just come randomly out. There's a lot of things cutting off up there. It really is abruptly stopped. There's not a whole lot of interest right here. The scene of interest is right here, but down here it doesn't quite work. So if I go to the next image, I brought it down. And now I've got lines coming out from the sides. If you're going to have lines coming out of the sides, don't have them come directly out of the corner. Have them come out either down below or up above. This, now our center of focus is actually right in the middle. And if you notice, all of our ants are kind of along the third lines here, which kind of works. With a little bit of Photoshop, took this image, and there's this distracting element here, the stick behind. I couldn't get that out. But by photoshopping it out, now we have a pretty strong image and lots of interesting intersections all coming to the middle. The middle can be a good element to use because everything else is actually on the outside of the middle shot. You come over here, here's a perfect example of a really mundane blah. If you have lines, coming straight across is not very interesting. If you notice, we've got straight lines here, up and down, left and right. By taking the same leaf and changing the angle, now we've got a more interesting angle. Notice this doesn't come exactly out of the corner. These are going off at angles. A much more interesting composition. So if you can, with macro, if it's not important that it's level, that you know it's growing up out of the ground, change your angle, and that's going to change your composition and add much more interest from a straight, boring line to more dynamic aspects of a curve or an angle. So take a look here. I've got something coming out right out of the corner. It's very, sort of boring. We got nice blurred background with a low f-stop at f5. But by taking that and cropping the image, now my stick is coming out from the top left side, but not the corner. And that's a much more interesting line leading you through the image with stuff coming over here. If you look, the leaves are around the thirds to the sixths. That's good elements. You come over to this aspect. Again, no straight lines. Actually, all the lines are curving down top left to bottom right. Even the grain of the wood, that's very important. By using that grain, this is actually a leaf combination that I found exactly like that on a fall day, and it just was perfect. By turning my camera, getting those angles really is what made the image interesting. Coming here, again, we've got an angle coming up across. The grain again is coming across. Got this really interesting tiger stripe pattern when the bark of an aspen starts to fall off. But I was looking around and I found an interesting leaf to complement this red one. And now I've got, again, more interesting, but no straight lines. It's not coming across. It's actually angling across. The angles apply and make this image more interesting. So remember, in macro, you don't have to shoot level. You can turn your camera 1 degree or a few degrees off to the side to create more interesting aspects. Again, cross coming down across the side, but look at the grain of the wood. I was very particular, because I wanted this grain to also, again, come out of the corners, not be straight up and down or left or right. And that really adds different lines, different textures, and your eye goes all over the picture. That's what makes it more interesting. Here, this is something kind of more of an abstract idea. I like the reflections and how the water was making it shimmer here, coming in straight, they coming out other directions. That's one thing to play with. If you ever have water around water plants, it's a nice way to get different ideas and different reflections. Here's another example of, this is a composition. I had this not straight lines, but if I use the crop tool here, I can actually rotate. So let's look at what happens if we turn our lines to be angles. Take the same picture. Now we've got angled lines, and that's much more interesting. Now the shot's definitely overexposed here. We can fix that. But looking at the composition, this is a much more interesting composition than going back to our straight lines. So you take a look here from the angle. When you're shooting macro, what angle that you shoot at, this is looking straight down the flower, and we've got this really interesting beetle sitting there. But if I actually would have got down to head level with the beetle, we get a much more interesting shot here, and also a nice clean blurred background of this beetle living in space, whereas here he's living in a cluttered background of other beetles and other flowers. And all I did was get lower. Changing your angle can often change the perspective. Getting low with this little ladybug, getting right into eye level, is really interesting and really profound. Taking a look at this fly, it's angling down a lot like the leaves, even though we can't make this stem be at an angle, but the fly is at an angle. That makes it work. Here, coming into the flower, the only way I can make this work is getting up close, because this fly was sitting on the edge of this leaf and the rest of the flowers in the area, and I had to get in. But now we have detail. Macro photography is about detail, and also look, a lot of the elements are on the third lines, so that makes the image okay. We saw this image before, rule of thirds, perfect example, putting the ant at the rule of thirds to look out. Good composition basis. And looking here, we've got the flower almost dead middle, we got some blurry stuff in the background, and it really detracts from the image. But if I put the flower closer to the third, a little bit better composition. So remember, don't put things in the middle unless you're going to do a square crop, get right up on them. But also, remember, if you can, turn things at an angle. This is the same dead musk thistleback, but you look here at an angle, pretty interesting. Going straight up and down, not quite as interesting as coming out from the side. So remember, you have leeway to change the angle of your camera to get better compositions. Change your angle, change your perspective, and that will get great images for your macro shots.